Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. In New York City's Democratic primary, three candidates backed by Mayor Zohran Mamdani won their races. Two defeated incumbent lawmakers. Another beat the candidate favored by the party establishment. Almost immediately, social media exploded with one simple conclusion. The Democratic Party has become the party of socialism. But has it? I don't think the answer is that simple. What happened in New York is politically significant. It tells us something important about where the Democratic Party is heading, but it does not necessarily tell us where America is heading. Those are two very different questions, and confusing them is exactly where so many political commentators go wrong. Let's start with the obvious. Mamdani's influence is real. A year ago, many political observers dismissed his victory as a fluke. They argued that he benefited from unusual circumstances, low voter turnout, and a divided field. Today, that argument has become much harder to make. Three more candidates he openly supported have now won their primaries, proving that his political brand is no longer limited to one election. He has become a genuine power broker inside New York Democratic politics. That matters because political influence tends to grow. Winning once may be luck. Winning repeatedly usually means you've built an organization, attracted volunteers, energized donors, and created a loyal base of supporters. That's exactly what Mamdani appears to be doing. Naturally, Republicans see an opportunity. For years, Republicans have argued that Democrats are drifting farther and farther to the left. Every time a self-described democratic socialist wins an election, it becomes another piece of evidence supporting that argument. Campaign ads almost write themselves. Republicans don't need to convince voters that every Democrat is a socialist. They only need to convince moderate suburban voters that the loudest voices inside the Democratic Party are becoming increasingly radical. And that's where this story becomes interesting. Because while Republicans are celebrating, many Democratic leaders are worried for an entirely different reason. Their concern isn't simply that progressive candidates are winning. Political parties always have internal factions. Republicans have experienced their own battles between establishment conservatives and the MAGA movement. Internal competition isn't unusual. The real question is whether the party establishment is gradually losing control over who defines the Democratic brand. That is a much more serious issue. For decades, Democratic leaders could generally shape the party's message from Washington. Today, however, social media personalities, activist organizations, and local progressive movements often set the political agenda before party leadership even has time to respond. Mamdani represents that new model of politics. He's young, he's highly effective on social media, he speaks the language of younger voters. His campaign focuses on issues that directly affect everyday life: housing costs, rent, healthcare, transportation, and the rising cost of living. Whether you agree with his policies or not, it's easy to understand why those messages resonate with younger voters struggling to afford life in one of America's most expensive cities. And that's an important distinction. Many commentators immediately label every progressive policy as socialism. But American politics is rarely that straightforward. When most Americans hear the word socialism, they often think of government ownership of industries, centralized economic planning, or eliminating private enterprise. That's not what most politicians calling themselves democratic socialists are actually proposing. Instead, they're generally advocating for larger government involvement in healthcare, stronger labor protections, higher taxes on wealthy Americans, expanded public housing, tuition assistance, and broader social welfare programs. You may support those ideas. You may strongly oppose them. But it's worth recognizing that they are not identical to the traditional socialist systems that existed during the Cold War. Understanding that distinction doesn't weaken conservative criticism. If anything, it makes the debate more honest. Critics argue that these policies steadily expand government power and reduce economic freedom. Supporters argue that they're necessary to address growing inequality and rising living costs. That's a legitimate political debate. Simply shouting socialism may energize your own supporters, but it doesn't necessarily persuade independent voters who are looking for a more nuanced explanation. Now let's look at something many people outside New York often overlook. New York City is not a typical American city politically. In many districts, the Democratic primary is effectively the real election because Republicans have little chance of winning in November. That changes voter behavior dramatically. Primary elections usually attract the most politically engaged voters. They tend to be more ideological than the general electorate. Moderate voters often stay home, while activists show up. Under those conditions, candidates with bold messages and enthusiastic grassroots organizations frequently outperform establishment politicians. In other words, what wins a Democratic primary in Brooklyn may not win a general election in Pennsylvania. That's why I think some reactions to those results have been exaggerated. Yes, New York is moving left. Yes, progressive candidates are gaining influence. Yes, Democratic leaders should pay attention. But none of those statements automatically mean the Democratic Party as a whole has become a socialist party. America isn't just New York. The Democratic coalition includes voters from rural Georgia, suburban Michigan, Latino communities in Arizona, union households in Wisconsin, and moderate professionals in Virginia. Those voters don't always agree with activists in New York or San Francisco. In fact, many Democratic candidates running in competitive districts intentionally distance themselves from the most progressive proposals because they understand their local voters have different priorities. That's why the next major political test won't happen in New York. It will happen in the battleground states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. Those states, not deep blue New York, will tell us whether the progressive movement can expand beyond its urban strongholds or whether it remains primarily a big city phenomenon. And that's exactly why this story is bigger than one mayor, one city, or one primary election. The real battle isn't between Democrats and Republicans, not yet. The real battle is happening inside the Democratic Party itself. For years, the party has managed to hold together a coalition that includes progressives, moderates, labor unions, minority communities, suburban professionals, and younger activists. As long as Donald Trump remained the dominant figure in Republican politics, that coalition largely stayed united because defeating Trump was the overriding priority. But political coalitions don't stay together forever. Once a party begins asking, "What do we actually stand for?" disagreements inevitably become more visible. That's what we're beginning to see today. Progressive activists argue that Democrats have spent too many years trying to appeal to moderate voters while failing to inspire their own base. They believe the party should stop apologizing for ambitious government programs and instead offer a bold economic vision that directly addresses the problems ordinary Americans face. Their argument is simple. Millions of Americans can't afford to buy a home. Rent continues to climb. Healthcare remains expensive. College graduates carry enormous student debt. Many young families believe they'll never enjoy the same standard of living their parents had. If the political establishment cannot solve those problems, voters naturally become willing to try something different. That's a message that resonates far beyond New York. At the same time, Democratic moderates see enormous risks. They remember what happened in states that actually decide presidential elections. Winning New York by 25 points doesn't help if you lose Pennsylvania by 1. Winning San Francisco by 30 points doesn't matter if Arizona slips away. American presidential elections aren't decided by the deepest blue districts. They're decided by independent voters living in suburbs around Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, Phoenix, and Atlanta. Those voters often describe themselves as politically moderate. They may support abortion rights while opposing higher taxes. They may favor stronger border security while also supporting immigration reform. They may want more affordable health care without embracing a dramatically larger federal government. They're not ideological. They're practical. And practical voters often decide elections. That's why Democratic leaders face an extraordinarily difficult balancing act. Move too far toward the progressive wing, and you risk alienating moderate swing voters. Move too far toward the center, and you risk depressing enthusiasm among younger activists who provide energy, volunteers, and grassroots fundraising. Neither option is politically comfortable. Republicans, meanwhile, understand this dilemma perfectly. Every victory by a progressive candidate gives Republicans another opportunity to argue that today's Democratic Party no longer resembles the party of Bill Clinton or even Barack Obama. Whether that argument is completely fair is almost beside the point. Politics is often about perception. If independent voters begin believing the Democratic Party is becoming too ideologically rigid, Republicans gain an advantage regardless of whether every Democratic candidate actually shares those positions. That explains why conservatives immediately highlighted slogans such as Free Palestine after the New York primary. For many progressives, that slogan represents solidarity with Palestinian civilians caught in decades of conflict. For many conservatives and for many moderate Americans, it raises entirely different questions. What exactly does that slogan mean? Does it simply call for greater humanitarian concern? Does it support a two-state solution? Or does it echo a slogan that some interpret as questioning Israel's very right to exist? Reasonable people answer those questions differently. But politically, the controversy itself matters. The more Democrats become associated with debates that many middle-of-the-road voters find confusing or uncomfortable, the easier it becomes for Republicans to shift attention away from economic issues and toward cultural and ideological conflicts. History offers an important lesson here. American political parties constantly reinvent themselves. The Republican Party of Ronald Reagan was not identical to the Republican Party of Donald Trump. Likewise, today's Democratic Party isn't identical to the Democratic Party of the 1990s. Political realignment is normal. The real question isn't whether change is happening. It clearly is. The question is whether this particular change expands the Democratic coalition or shrinks it. That's something no primary election can answer. Only general elections can. And that's why I think some of the loudest reactions missed the bigger picture. New York didn't deliver a final verdict on America's political future. It revealed an ongoing argument about the Democratic Party's future. Those are two very different things. If progressive candidates continue winning not only in New York, but also in competitive congressional districts across states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona, then we'll know the movement has truly become a national force. If they struggle outside deep blue urban districts, history may remember New York not as the beginning of a national political revolution, but as an example of how unique local politics can be. For Republicans, the strategy is straightforward. Continue portraying every Democratic candidate through the lens of the party's most progressive voices. For Democrats, the challenge is much harder. They must convince voters they can embrace new ideas without alienating the political center that has decided so many modern American elections. That's a difficult balance for any political party. So, is the Democratic Party becoming socialist? I think that's the wrong question. A better question is this: who gets to define what today's Democratic Party actually is? Is it the traditional party establishment that has dominated Democratic politics for decades? Or is it a younger, more progressive generation demanding a fundamentally different vision for America's future? The answer won't come from one mayor, one city, or one election. It will emerge over the next several years through dozens of competitive races across the country where voters, not commentators, will ultimately decide which vision they believe offers the better future for America. And that's why what happened in New York deserves our attention. Not because it settles the debate, but because it has only just begun. Thanks for watching.